The dust swirled across the parched Main Street of St. Louis, Missouri, as Harriet Keating clutched her medical diagnosis to her chest, the paper feeling like a lead weight in her trembling hands. The year was 1876, and at 26, she had just received news that would forever alter the course of her life, news she would soon have to share with the man who had been courting her these past months. Frank Zimmerman tied his chestnut stallion to the post outside the general store, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. At 32, he had established himself as one of the most respected ranchers in the county, his cattle operation growing steadily since he'd arrived from back east 5 years earlier. He tipped his hat to the ladies passing by, his eyes scanning the boardwalk for the familiar silhouette of the woman who had captured his heart. When he spotted Harriet, his face broke into a warm smile that quickly faded when he saw her expression. She stood rigid, her usually bright eyes downcast, her fingers worrying the edge of the paper she held. "Harriet," Frank approached cautiously, concern etched across his weathered features. "What's troubling you?" She looked up, tears threatening to spill. "Frank, I need to speak with you privately." He nodded, offering his arm. "Let's walk to the park." They made their way in silence to the small green space at the edge of town, finding a bench beneath an old oak tree. The late summer breeze rustled the leaves overhead, providing a gentle soundtrack to the heavy moment. "I saw Dr. Morrison today," Harriet began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been having concerns." Frank took her hand in his callous thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Harriet drew in a shaky breath. "The doctor confirmed what I've feared for some time." She finally met his gaze, her eyes swimming with sorrow. "Frank, I can't have children. There's a problem with my womb. It's malformed, the doctor says." She waited for his expression to change, for disappointment to cloud his features, but instead he squeezed her hand tighter. "Is that all?" he asked softly. "Is that all?" she repeated, incredulous. "Frank, I know how much you want a family. You've spoken of children, of passing your ranch to a son someday. I can't give you that." Frank Zimmerman studied her face for a long moment. Then he gently took the diagnosis paper from her hand, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his vest pocket. He cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes steady and sure. "Harriet Keating, you think I've been courting you these months because I saw you as nothing more than a vessel for children." His voice was low, tender. "I've been courting you because you're the woman who brings light to my days. Because your laugh makes my heart soar. Because you're brave and kind and smarter than anyone I've ever known." A tear slipped down her cheek, and he brushed it away with his thumb. "I want to build a life with you," he continued. "Children or no children." She shook her head, pulling back slightly. "You say that now, but what about years from now? What about when your friends' wives are having babies and I remain barren? What about your legacy, my legacy?" Frank smiled, taking her hands again. "Harriet, my legacy is how I live, how I love, how I treat others. It's not about blood." "But no buts," he interrupted gently. "I know my mind, Harriet, and my heart. They both belong to you." She studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt or disappointment. Finding none, she let out a trembling breath. "You deserve to think on this, Frank. This isn't a small thing," he nodded. "Fair enough, I'll think on it, but know this, my feelings won't change." As they walked back toward town, Frank kept her hand tucked securely in his arm. Harriet couldn't help but wonder if his reassurances would stand the test of time, if the absence of children would eventually create a void neither could fill. The following week passed in a blur of uncertainty for Harriet. She threw herself into her work at the town library, cataloging new books that had arrived from St. Louis. Each evening, She'd walk home to the modest house she shared with her widowed aunt, Martha, who had raised her since her parents' death from cholera when Harriet was just 12. On Friday afternoon, Frank appeared at the library, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. "Miss Keating," he said formally, aware of the other patrons nearby. "I was wondering if you might accompany me on a ride tomorrow morning. There's something I'd like to show you." Harriet felt her heart quicken. "Yes, I think I could manage that. I'll come for you at dawn if that's not too early," she nodded. Dawn it is. That night, sleep eluded her. What did Frank want to show her? Had he reconsidered his position about children? Had he decided to end their courtship? When the first light of dawn crept through her curtains, Harriet was already dressed in her riding clothes, a practical divided skirt that had scandalized some of the more traditional women in town, but was far safer for riding than attempting to side-saddle in a full dress. Frank arrived precisely as the sun breached the horizon, leading not only his stallion but also a gentle mare for Harriet. He helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "It's about an hour's ride," he explained. "Are you comfortable?" "Perfectly," she assured him, though her stomach was in knots. They rode in companionable silence as the landscape gradually changed from the outskirts of town to rolling prairie. Frank led them up a gentle incline, and as they crested the hill, Harriet gasped at the view. Below them stretched a lush valley with a clear stream winding through it. A stand of cottonwoods provided shade and wildflowers dotted the grass. In the distance, a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Frank dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Taking her hand, he led her to a spot overlooking the valley. "This is the newest addition to my ranch," he explained. "I purchased it last month. I've been thinking about what to do with it." Harriet looked at him quizzically. "It's perfect grazing land, isn't it?" "It is," he agreed. "But I had another idea." He took both her hands in his. "Harriet, I've spent this week thinking as you asked me to, and every thought led me back to you." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I've been to every town meeting where you've advocated for an orphanage in St. Louis," he continued. "I've heard your passion when you speak about the children who have no homes, no families." Harriet's breath caught in her throat. "Frank, this land," he gestured to the valley below, "could be the perfect place for that orphanage you've been fighting for. Safe, away from the saloons and the rougher elements of town, but close enough for the children to attend school." Tears welled in her eyes. "You would do that?" Frank smiled, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small box. "I would do that and so much more if you would agree to be my wife." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I know we can't have children of our own, Harriet. But there are so many children who need love, who need a family. We could give them that together." Harriet's hands flew to her mouth, tears now flowing freely. "Oh, Frank, I'm not asking you to answer right away," he said hurriedly. "I know it's a big decision. But I want you to know that I've thought about it, truly thought about it, and my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger." Harriet looked out over the valley, imagining it filled with the sounds of children laughing, playing. Then she looked back at the man before her, this man who had seen her deepest wound and offered not pity but partnership, not disappointment but dreams. "Frank Zimmerman," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I don't need more time. My answer is yes. Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. As they stood there on the hilltop, the future spread before them like the valley below, wide open and full of possibility. The news of their engagement spread quickly through St. Louis. Most offered congratulations, though a few raised eyebrows at Frank's choice, a librarian with no dowry to speak of, and, as town gossip Isabella Thompson whispered behind her fan, unlikely to provide heirs. Harriet tried not to let such talk affect her, focusing instead on the wedding preparations and on drafting a formal proposal for the orphanage. Frank had donated the land, but they would need additional funds and community support to make the vision a reality. 3 weeks after their engagement, Harriet was organizing a display of new agricultural texts at the library when the door swung open with force. She looked up to see Thomas Reid, a rival rancher who had been trying to buy Frank's land for years. "Miss Keating," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet space. "Or should I say the future Mrs. Zimmerman?" Harriet straightened, wary of his tone. "Can I help you find something, Mr. Reid?" He approached her desk, leaning forward on his knuckles. "I was just wondering if Frank's told you everything about himself, about his past." A chill ran down Harriet's spine. "Whatever you have to say, Mr. Reid, I suggest you say it directly to Frank." Reid's mouth twisted into an unpleasant smile. "Oh, I'm sure he'd prefer that. But as a concerned citizen, I thought you should know who you're marrying." Mrs. Dunbar, the head librarian, emerged from the back room. "Is there a problem here, Miss Keating?" Harriet kept her eyes locked with Reid's. "No problem. Mr. Reid was just leaving." Reid straightened, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "Indeed I was. Good day, ladies." After he left, Mrs. Dunbar approached Harriet. "That man has always been trouble. Don't you pay him any mind." But Harriet couldn't shake the encounter. What had Reid been implying? Did Frank have secrets he hadn't shared with her? That evening, she decided to walk to Frank's office in town rather than wait for him to call on her as planned. She found him at his desk, poring over ledgers in the lamplight. He looked up in surprise when she entered. "Harriet." "I was just finishing up before coming to see you." She closed the door behind her. "Frank, Thomas Reid came to the library today." The change in Frank's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes, a slight clench of his jaw. "What did he want?" "He implied there are things about your past that I don't know, things you haven't told me." She sat across from him. "Is that true?" Frank set down his pen and pushed the ledger aside. For a long moment he was silent, his gaze dropping to his hands. When he looked up, there was a sadness in his eyes Harriet had never seen before. "Yes," he said finally. "There are things I haven't told you, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because they're painful to speak of." Harriet reached across the desk to take his hand. "Whatever it is, Frank, we can face it together, just as you said to me." He nodded, drawing a deep breath. "Before I came to Missouri, I lived in Kansas. I wasn't always a rancher." His voice grew quieter. "I was married, Harriet. Her name was Sarah." Harriet felt a jolt of surprise but kept her expression neutral. "What happened?" "We had been married 2 years when she became pregnant. She was so happy, we both were." His eyes grew distant with memory. "But the birth was difficult. The doctor couldn't stop the bleeding." He swallowed hard. "I lost them both, Sarah and our daughter, in a single night." Harriet's heart ached for him. "Oh, Frank, I'm so sorry. After they died, I couldn't stay in Kansas. Every street, every room in our house held memories. I sold everything, came to Missouri, and started over." He squeezed her hand. "I should have told you sooner. I was afraid. Afraid you might think I was only interested in you because you reminded me of her somehow. But that's not true, Harriet. What I feel for you is entirely its own." "Is that what Reid was referring to? Your first marriage?" Frank's expression darkened. "Partly, but there's more. After Sarah died, I wasn't myself. I started drinking heavily. Got into a fight with Reid's brother in a saloon in Kansas. Things escalated." He met her gaze directly. "I shot him, Harriet. It was ruled self-defense. He drew on me first, but Reid has never forgiven me. He followed me to Missouri, bought land nearby, and has been trying to run me out ever since." Harriet sat back, processing everything. Why didn't you tell me any of this? At first, it wasn't relevant to our friendship. Then, as my feelings grew, I worried it would change how you saw me. He ran a hand through his hair. And after your news about not being able to have children, I didn't want you to think I was comparing you to Sarah, or that I was somehow trying to replace the child I lost. Harriet stood, walking around the desk to stand beside him. Frank, we all have pasts. We've all experienced loss, made mistakes. What matters is who we are now and where we're going. He looked up at her, relief and love mingling in his eyes. And where are we going, Harriet Keating? She smiled, leaning down to kiss him gently. Forward, Frank Zimmerman, always forward. The weeks leading up to their wedding were filled with preparations not just for the ceremony, but also for the orphanage. Harriet presented their proposal at a town meeting, standing tall despite the whispers that followed her since Reed's visit to the library. The children need more than just shelter, she explained to the assembled townspeople. They need education, care, and the chance to learn practical skills that will serve them in adulthood. Many voiced support, but others raised concerns about cost and practicality. It was Sheriff Miller who finally stood in Harriet's defense. Folks, I've seen firsthand what happens to children left to fend for themselves. They end up either dead or in my jail. He looked around the room. This orphanage isn't just charity, it's an investment in our town's future. By the end of the meeting, they had secured enough pledges of support to begin construction. Frank hired workers the very next day, determined to have at least the main building completed before winter set in. As the October wedding approached, Harriet found herself spending more time at Frank's ranch, helping to oversee the orphanage construction. One afternoon, as they were reviewing plans with the builder, a rider approached at speed. "Fire!" the young man shouted as he reined in his horse. Fire at the north pasture. Frank was on his horse in seconds, shouting instructions to the ranch hands. "Harriet, stay here," he called as he galloped away, but Harriet had already mounted her mare. She followed at a distance, arriving at the north pasture to find a wall of flames advancing toward a stand of dry brush that led directly to the orphanage construction site. Frank and his men were working frantically to contain the blaze, using wet blankets to beat at the edges. Harriet rode to the creek, filled 2 buckets, and returned to help douse the flames. For hours they fought the fire, faces blackened with soot, lungs burning from smoke. When the last ember was finally extinguished, Frank found Harriet slumped against a boulder, exhausted. "You should have stayed back," he admonished gently, kneeling beside her. She gave him a weary smile. "And let you have all the glory, not likely." His expression grew serious. "This was no accident, Harriet. The fire started in 3 separate locations." "Raid," Frank nodded grimly. "Most likely. But without proof, there's little Sheriff Miller can do." That night, as Harriet was preparing to return to town, Frank pulled her aside. "I want you to be careful. Reed's escalating, and I'm worried he might target you next." "I'm not afraid of him," she said, though the thought sent a shiver down her spine. "Maybe not, but I am." Frank's eyes were intense. "Promise me you'll be vigilant," she nodded. "I promise." The next morning, Harriet arrived at the library to find a note slipped under the door. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it to read. "A barren wife and fatherless children fitting companions for a murderer. Withdraw your orphanage proposal, or next time, the fire won't be so easily contained." Harriet immediately took the note to Sheriff Miller, who promised to increase patrols around both the library and the construction site. But when she showed the note to Frank that evening, his reaction was unexpected. "We should postpone the wedding," he said, his jaw set. "Maybe even the orphanage." "What? No," Harriet protested. "That's exactly what Reed wants." I don't care what Reed wants, I care about your safety. Frank, if we back down now, he wins. Is that the example we want to set for the children we hope to help? Frank paced the length of his office. Harriet, you don't understand what Reed is capable of. Then help me understand, she challenged. But don't make decisions for me. We're partners in this, remember? He stopped pacing, regarding her with a mixture of frustration and admiration. You're right, I'm sorry. He sat heavily in his chair. Reed's not just a rival rancher. Back in Kansas, he was involved in some shady dealings, rustling, intimidation. The kind of man who holds grudges and doesn't mind getting his hands dirty to settle them. All the more reason not to let him dictate our lives, Harriet insisted. We'll be careful, but we won't hide. Frank studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we're taking precautions. No more riding alone, and I'm hiring extra men to guard the construction site. The next 2 weeks passed in tense vigilance. The orphanage construction continued, though now under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Harriet was never without an escort, much to her frustration. But there were no further incidents, and slowly, the town began buzzing with excitement for the upcoming wedding. 3 days before the ceremony, Harriet was selecting books at the library that might be suitable for the orphanage when Mrs. Dunbar approached with an envelope. This just arrived for you, dear. Special delivery. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a crude map drawn on it and the words, "If you want to know the truth about your fiancé, come alone to this location tonight at 8. Tell no one." Harriet's first instinct was to dismiss it as another of Reed's tricks, but something held her back from immediately showing it to Frank or the sheriff. What if there was some truth Reed knew that Frank hadn't shared? Didn't she owe it to herself to find out before the wedding? She spent the rest of the day in turmoil, weighing her options. By evening, she had made her decision. She would go, but not alone. She showed the note to her Aunt Martha, who insisted on accompanying her. "This is foolishness, Harriet," Martha scolded as they rode in a hired buggy toward the meeting place, an abandoned cabin on the edge of town. "We should have told the sheriff. If it's nothing, then we've bothered the sheriff for no reason," Harriet reasoned. "And if it's something, well, I need to know." They arrived at the cabin as darkness fell. Harriet instructed Martha to wait with the buggy while she approached the door. "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, go for the sheriff," she instructed. With a deep breath, she knocked. The door creaked open to reveal not Reed, but a woman Harriet had never seen before, slender, with dark hair and haunted eyes. "You must be Harriet," the woman said softly. "Please come in." Warily, Harriet entered the dimly lit cabin. A single lantern cast long shadows across the rough wooden floor. "Who are you?" Harriet demanded. "Where's Reed?" "My name is Emily Winters. Thomas Reed is my cousin." The woman gestured to a chair. "Please sit. What I have to tell you won't take long." Harriet remained standing. "If this is another attempt to intimidate me, it's not," Emily interrupted. "At least, not by me, Thomas. He has his own agenda, but I can't be part of it anymore." She took a deep breath. "Frank Zimmerman isn't who you think he is. If this is about his past in Kansas, I already know." Emily shook her head. "Not everything. Did he tell you why he really left Kansas? It wasn't just grief over his wife and child. It was because he was running from the law." Harriet's heart raced. "What do you mean?" The fight with Reed's brother wasn't self-defense. "Frank shot him in cold blood, then fled before he could be properly tried." "I don't believe you," Harriet said firmly, though a seed of doubt had been planted. Emily reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "See for yourself." Harriet took the paper with trembling hands. The headline read, "Local man shot in saloon dispute, suspect flees." The article described a confrontation between Frank Zimmerman and Joseph Reed, ending with Reed's death and Zimmerman's disappearance before authorities could complete their investigation. This doesn't prove it wasn't self-defense, Harriet argued, though her voice lacked conviction. There were witnesses, Emily insisted. People who saw Frank draw first. Then why hasn't Reed gone to the authorities here? Why the threats and intimidation? Emily looked away. Thomas doesn't trust the law. He wants his own justice. Harriet carefully folded the clipping and placed it in her pocket. Thank you for sharing this with me, Miss Winters. I'll take it into consideration. As she turned to leave, Emily caught her arm. Be careful, Miss Keating. Thomas won't stop until Frank pays for what he did. Outside, Martha was pacing beside the buggy. What happened? Who was in there? Not now, Harriet murmured, climbing into the vehicle. Let's get back to town. That night, Harriet barely slept, the newspaper clipping seeming to burn through her nightstand drawer where she'd hidden it. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She found Frank at the orphanage construction site, supervising the installation of windows. When he saw her approach, his face lit up. Harriet, I didn't expect you until this afternoon. His smile faded when he saw her expression. What's wrong? She led him away from the workers toward a quiet spot beneath a cottonwood tree. Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need the complete truth. He nodded, concern creasing his brow. Always. She withdrew the newspaper clipping from her pocket. Is this accurate? Did you flee Kansas before a proper investigation into Joseph Reed's death could be completed? Frank's face drained of color as he took the paper from her. Where did you get this? Does it matter? Is it true? He stared at the clipping for a long moment, then met her gaze. Yes and no. Yes, I left Kansas before the investigation was complete. No, it wasn't because I was guilty. Then why run? Frank sighed heavily, leaning against the tree trunk. Because Reed had the sheriff in his pocket. His family owned half the county. There was no chance of a fair trial, not after witnesses started changing their stories overnight. He handed the clipping back to her. I didn't flee justice, Harriet. I fled injustice. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Why didn't you tell me this part? Because it sounds like an excuse, doesn't it? The guilty man always claims the system is rigged against him. He took her hands. I've tried to build an honest life here, to be a man you could be proud to marry. If that's not possible anymore, I understand. Harriet was silent for a long moment, weighing everything she knew about the man before her against the accusations in the newspaper. Finally, she tore the clipping in half, then in quarters. I believe you, Frank. I trust the man I've come to know, not some old news article or the words of Reed's cousin. Relief washed over his features. Reed's cousin? Emily Winters. She's the one who gave me this. She scattered the torn pieces of paper to the wind. She said Reed won't stop until you pay for what you did. Frank's expression hardened. Then we need to end this once and for all. That afternoon, Frank rode into town to speak with Sheriff Miller, laying out the full story of his history with the Reed family. The sheriff listened attentively, occasionally making notes. So you think Reed's behind the fire and the threats? Miller asked when Frank finished. I'm certain of it, and I'm worried he's planning something worse. Miller leaned back in his chair. Problem is, we need evidence. Your word against his won't be enough, especially with your complicated history. What if we could get him to confess? Harriet suggested. Both men turned to look at her. He doesn't know I met with Emily. What if I reached out to him, pretended to have doubts about Frank? He might reveal something incriminating. Absolutely not, Frank said firmly. It's too dangerous. I agree, the sheriff added. Reed's not a man to underestimate, but Harriet persisted. It doesn't have to be a face-to-face meeting. I could write him a letter, arrange to meet somewhere public. You could have deputies nearby. Frank and the sheriff exchanged glances. It could work, Miller admitted reluctantly, if we do it right. Despite Frank's continued objections, a plan was formulated. Harriet wrote a letter to Reed, expressing concern over what she'd learned about Frank's past and requesting a meeting at the town's busy cafe the following day. Reed's response came quickly, an agreement to meet, with an eagerness that sent a chill down Harriet's spine. The next morning, Harriet entered the cafe, aware of Sheriff Miller and a deputy seated at a corner table, and Frank watching from the barber shop across the street. She chose a table near the window and ordered coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her skirts. Reed arrived precisely on time, his tall figure casting a shadow across her table. "Miss Keating, I'm pleased you reached out." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reed. I've been troubled by certain information that's come to my attention." Reed ordered coffee, then leaned forward. "About Zimmerman, I presume," she nodded, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I've heard conflicting accounts of what happened in Kansas. I thought perhaps you could clarify." A smile spread across Reed's face, not pleasant but satisfied. "Of course. My brother Joseph was a good man. Zimmerman shot him over a card game dispute, then ran before justice could be served. If that's true, why haven't you brought this to Sheriff Miller?" Reed's lip curled. "Zimmerman's got Miller fooled just like he's got you fooled. The law failed in Kansas. I have no reason to think it would work here." "So you've taken matters into your own hands," Harriet pressed, heart pounding. "The fire at Frank's ranch, the threatening notes." Reed's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about, don't you?" "Because it seems like someone is very determined to drive Frank away or worse. And if they are, could you blame them after what he did?" Reed's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "He took my brother's life. An eye for an eye, wouldn't you say?" Harriet leaned back, trying to keep her expression neutral despite her racing heart. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Reed?" He studied her for a moment, then his demeanor suddenly changed, becoming almost jovial. "Nothing at all, Miss Keating. Merely philosophical musings." He stood, dropping coins on the table for his untouched coffee. "I should be going. Think carefully about the man you're planning to marry. Some stains don't wash out." As Reed left the cafe, Harriet caught Sheriff Miller's eye. The lawman nodded slightly, acknowledging that he'd heard every word, then followed Reed out. Frank was at her side in moments. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "He didn't exactly confess, but—" "It was enough to confirm our suspicions," Frank said grimly. "Miller will keep an eye on him, but without concrete evidence. He'll make his move soon," Harriet predicted. "He all but admitted it." Frank helped her to her feet. "Then we need to be ready." The day before the wedding dawned clear and bright. The orphanage's main building was nearly complete, its fresh cut timber gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Despite Reed's threats, despite the tension hanging over them, there was a sense of hope in the air. Harriet spent the morning with her aunt, finishing the final adjustments to her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. They were just packing it away when a knock came at the door. Martha answered to find a young boy holding an envelope. "For Miss Keating," he said, then darted away before she could question him. The note inside contained just 3 words: "Tonight, the orphanage." Harriet's blood ran cold. "Reed's making his move," she told her aunt. "I need to get to Frank." Martha clutched her arm. "No, Harriet. This is exactly what he wants. You need to take this to the sheriff." But when they reached the sheriff's office, they found it empty except for the young deputy, who informed them that Miller had ridden out to investigate reports of rustling on the north side of the county. "We can't wait," Harriet insisted. "I need to warn Frank." She found him at his ranch house, reviewing security arrangements with his foreman. When she showed him the note, his face darkened. "This ends tonight," he said with quiet determination. I'm tired of living under Reed's shadow, tired of wondering when he'll strike next." "What are you planning to do?" Harriet asked, alarmed by the steel in his voice. "Meet him, on my terms." "Frank, no, that's what he wants." "Exactly, and he's going to get more than he bargained for." Frank turned to his foreman. "Gather the men. I want them positioned around the orphanage by sunset, but out of sight. If Reed shows up with company, I want to know." Despite Harriet's continued protests, Frank was resolute. As evening approached, he strapped on his gun belt for the first time since she'd known him. "You're not coming," he told her firmly. "Stay here with Martha." "If you think I'm letting you face Reed alone, you don't know me very well, Frank Zimmerman," she retorted. "We're in this together, remember." They arrived at the orphanage site as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the newly constructed building. Frank's men were already in position, hidden among the trees and behind the supply wagons. Frank helped Harriet down from her horse. "Stay close to me," he murmured, "and if anything happens, run. Don't look back." They approached the main building cautiously. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of lamplight visible within. Frank pushed it open wider, his hand hovering near his gun. Inside they found not Reed but Emily Winters, seated at the rough-hewn table that would someday serve orphan children. "Miss Winters," Harriet said in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Emily's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I had to warn you, Thomas. He's gone too far." Frank stepped forward. "Where is he?" "On his way. He plans to burn it all, the orphanage, your ranch. He's gathered men, they're coming from the north." She looked up at them, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted justice for Joseph." "There will be justice," Frank assured her, his voice gentle despite the tension in his posture. "But not like this." A shout from outside drew their attention. One of Frank's men burst through the door. Riders approaching from the north, at least 6 of them. Frank turned to Emily. "Get her out of here," he instructed the ranch hand. "Take her to town, to the sheriff's office." As they hurried Emily away, Frank drew Harriet into the shadows beside the doorway. "I meant what I said. If this turns ugly, I want you to run." But Harriet stood her ground. "We face this together." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Frank stepped onto the porch, Harriet at his side. In the gathering dusk, they could make out a group of riders, Reed at their head. "Zimmerman," Reed called, reining in his horse. "I see you got my invitation." "This ends now, Reed," Frank responded, his voice carrying across the yard. "I've had enough of your threats, your games." Reed dismounted, his men following suit. "Oh, it ends tonight, all right. Just not the way you're hoping." Frank's men emerged from their hiding places, rifles raised. Reed's party hesitated, suddenly realizing they were outnumbered. "You've got 2 choices," Frank announced. "Ride away now and never come back, or face charges for arson, intimidation, and attempted murder." Reed laughed, a harsh sound in the twilight. "On whose testimony?" "Yours." "A fugitive from Kansas justice, mine," came a voice from behind them. Sheriff Miller rode into the clearing, accompanied by several deputies. "And Miss Winters. She's told us everything, Reed, about the fire, the threats, your plans for tonight." Reed's face contorted with rage. "She's lying." "She's my blood. She wouldn't betray me like that." "Some bonds are stronger than blood," Miller replied. "Like the bond of doing what's right." He dismounted, drawing his pistol. "Thomas Reed, you're under arrest for arson and conspiracy to commit murder." For a moment, it seemed Reed might surrender. Then, with a movement so quick it was almost a blur, he drew his gun and fired at Frank. Harriet screamed as Frank staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. Before Reed could fire again, multiple shots rang out from the sheriff, from Frank's men, from Frank himself, who had drawn and fired despite his wound. Reed collapsed to his knees, his gun falling from limp fingers. Blood bloomed across his chest as he toppled forward onto the dirt. In the chaos that followed, Harriet had eyes only for Frank. She rushed to his side, helping him into the orphanage where she could examine his wound in better light. "It's just a graze," he assured her, though his face was pale with pain. "I've had worse from branding calves." She bathed the wound with water from a canteen, then bound it with strips torn from her petticoat. "You were lucky." Outside, they could hear the sheriff giving orders, the sound of Reed's body being loaded onto a wagon, his men being disarmed and detained. "It's over," Frank said quietly. "Really over?" Harriet leaned her forehead against his good shoulder. "Thank God." They stayed that way for a long moment, the reality of their narrow escape sinking in. Then Frank tilted her chin up, his eyes serious. "Harriet, after all this, if you want to postpone the wedding, I understand. You've seen a side of me, of my life," that she silenced him with a kiss. "Frank Zimmerman, if you think a little gunfight is going to stop me from marrying you tomorrow, you're sorely mistaken." A slow smile spread across his face. "Is that so?" "It is." She helped him to his feet. "Now let's get you to the doctor, so you can be presentable for our wedding." The next day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself was celebrating with them. The small church in St. Louis was filled to capacity, townspeople crowding the pews to witness the union of Frank Zimmerman and Harriet Keating. Frank stood at the altar, his injured arm in a sling but his face radiant as Harriet walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm. Her ivory dress caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, and Frank thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. When it came time for their vows, Frank took Harriet's hands in his voice strong and clear as he promised to love and cherish her for all his days. Harriet's voice trembled slightly as she made the same promises in return, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The celebration afterward was joyous, the shadow of Reed's threats finally lifted. As evening fell, the newlyweds slipped away from the festivities, riding to Frank's ranch, now their home. In the privacy of their bedroom, as moonlight spilled through the curtains, Harriet stood nervously as Frank approached. He cupped her face gently in his hands. "My wife," he said, the words a caress. She smiled up at him, her heart racing. "My husband." As they came together in the tender exploration of new intimacy, Harriet felt a sense of homecoming, of rightness that transcended physical pleasure. This was where she belonged with this man, in this life they were building together. Later, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Harriet's thoughts turned to the future. "The orphanage should be ready by Christmas," she murmured. Frank agreed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Miller says there are 3 children in need of placement, already siblings whose parents died of fever last month." Harriet propped herself up on an elbow. 3? We should be ready for them sooner then." "They shouldn't have to wait until Christmas." Frank smiled up at her. "Whatever you think best, Mrs. Zimmerman." She loved the sound of her new name on his lips, but as she settled back against his chest, a familiar sadness crept in. "I just wish—" "What?" he prompted gently. "I wish I could give you a child of your own." Her voice was small in the darkness. "A son or daughter with your eyes, your smile." Frank was quiet for so long that Harriet wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then he shifted, gathering her close. "Harriet," he said, his voice low and fervent, "I want you to listen to me very carefully." She nodded against his chest. "When I lost Sarah and our baby, I thought I'd never want a family again. The pain was too great." His hand stroked her hair. "But you showed me how to hope again, how to dream of a future." She blinked back tears. "Frank, let me finish," he said gently. "Those children at the orphanage, they'll be ours in every way that matters. We'll raise them, teach them, love them. And if you think for one moment that I'll love them less because they don't have my eyes or your smile, then you don't know me at all." She raised her head to look at him, his features silvered in the moonlight. "I can't give you children," she whispered, the admission still painful despite everything. Frank's eyes held hers, steady and sure. "You already give me everything," he whispered back. "Your strength, your courage, your heart. What more could I possibly want?" In that moment, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the man she was meant to love. The path ahead might not be the one she had once envisioned, but it was no less beautiful for being unexpected. "I love you, Frank Zimmerman," she said, the words simple but carrying the weight of all she felt. "And I love you, Harriet Zimmerman," he replied, pulling her down for a kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows. Spring came early to Missouri the following year. The orphanage, now officially named Zimmerman Home for Children, housed 8 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12. The 3 siblings who had been the first arrivals had settled in beautifully, their initial wariness giving way to trust and even joy. Harriet divided her time between the orphanage and her continued work at the library, organizing regular story times that brought the children into town and helped integrate them into the community. Frank had expanded his cattle operation, hiring several of the older boys from town to help with the easier tasks, teaching them valuable skills while providing much-needed income for their families. On a warm May afternoon, Harriet was supervising the children in the orphanage garden when she saw a wagon approaching. She shaded her eyes against the sun, recognizing Frank's tall figure driving the team. Beside him sat a woman Harriet didn't recognize, and in the back of the wagon, huddled beneath a blanket despite the warmth of the day, was a small figure. "Children, continue with your planting," Harriet instructed. "Mary, you're in charge until I return." The oldest girl, 12-year-old Mary Thompson, nodded solemnly, proud of the responsibility. Harriet hurried to meet the wagon as Frank brought it to a stop in front of the main building. "What is this?" she asked, noting the grave expression on her husband's face. "Harriet, this is Mrs. Lone Elk," Frank introduced the woman beside him. "She's from the Osage tribe that lives beyond Creek Valley." The woman nodded respectfully to Harriet. Her face was lined with age and sorrow, her dark eyes holding wisdom and pain in equal measure. "Mrs. Lone Elk found this child wandering alone near their hunting grounds," Frank continued. "Her parents were settlers who died of sickness. The child has no other family." Harriet moved to the back of the wagon, where the small figure remained motionless beneath the blanket. Gently, she pulled it back to reveal a girl of perhaps 3 years, with matted blonde hair and large, frightened blue eyes. The child was painfully thin, her skin marked with insect bites and scratches from the wilderness. "Hello, little one," Harriet said softly. "My name is Harriet. What's yours?" The girl stared at her silently, then buried her face in the blanket. "She doesn't speak," Mrs. Lone Elk explained. "Not since we found her. 3 days now, not a word." Harriet's heart ached for the trauma. This child must have endured watching her parents die, wandering alone in the wilderness, being found by strangers whose language and appearance would have been unfamiliar and frightening. "Thank you for bringing her to us," Harriet told the Osage woman. "We'll take good care of her." Mrs. Lone Elk studied Harriet's face, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she saw there. "She is strong. She survived alone for many days, but she needs gentleness now, after Mrs. Lone Elk had gone, refusing payment but accepting gifts of coffee, sugar, and cloth. Harriet carried the little girl into the orphanage. The child clung to the blanket, refusing to let it go even when Harriet prepared a bath for her. "It's all right," Harriet soothed. "You can keep the blanket." But we need to get you clean and find you some nice clothes. Would you like that?" The girl didn't respond, but she didn't resist as Harriet gently washed away the dirt and tangles. Beneath the grime, she was a beautiful child, with delicate features and those enormous blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "What should we call her?" Frank asked later, as the newly bathed and clothed child sat at the kitchen table, taking small, careful bites of stew as if afraid it might be taken away. "I've been calling her Little One," Harriet replied, "but she needs a proper name." They watched as the girl reached for a piece of bread, her movements still guarded. "Hope," Frank suggested quietly, "because that's what she needs now, what we all need." Harriet smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "Hope, yes, I think that's perfect." That night, after the other children were in bed, Harriet sat in a rocking chair in the small room they had prepared for Hope, singing softly as the exhausted child finally surrendered to sleep. Frank found her there, still rocking, still watching over the little girl whose life had been entrusted to their care. "She's so small," Harriet whispered as Frank knelt beside the chair. "So vulnerable. But safe now," Frank reminded her, his hand covering hers. "Because of you. Because of the home you've created here." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder. "We created it together." As summer turned to fall, Hope began to emerge from her shell. Though she still didn't speak, she would respond to her name, follow simple instructions, and occasionally even smile, a rare and precious sight that never failed to bring joy to Harriet's heart. One crisp October day, Harriet was showing Hope how to collect eggs from the chicken coop when the little girl suddenly froze, her eyes fixed on something behind Harriet. Turning, Harriet saw Frank approaching, leading his stallion by the reins. "Good morning, my ladies," he called cheerfully. "How goes the egg gathering?" Hope dropped her basket and ran not away from Frank as Harriet feared, but toward the horse. She stopped a few feet away, her small hand extended toward the animal's nose. Frank knelt beside her. "Would you like to pet him, Hope?" "His name is Thunder, but don't let that scare you. He's gentle as a lamb." To Harriet's amazement, Hope nodded, the first clear communication they'd received from her. Frank lifted her carefully, holding her so she could stroke the horse's velvety muzzle. The child's face lit up with wonder. "Papa Horse," she said suddenly, her voice small but distinct. Frank nearly dropped her in surprise. "What did you say, little one, Papa Horse?" Hope repeated, patting Thunder's neck. Then she pointed at Frank. "Papa." Frank's eyes met Harriet's over the child's head, both of them stunned into momentary silence. Then Frank cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. If you'd like me to be, Hope. If that's what you want." Hope nodded solemnly, then turned to look at Harriet, who had moved closer. "Mama," she asked, the simple question holding worlds of longing. Harriet felt tears spill down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Hope, I would be honored to be your mama." That evening, after Hope was tucked into bed, her new doll clutched tightly in her arms, Frank and Harriet sat before the fire in their private quarters, processing the day's events. "I've sent a letter to Judge Wilson in St. Louis," Frank said, "asking about formal adoption procedures. For Hope and perhaps for some of the others as well." Harriet looked up from her sewing in surprise. "Others?" "Mary, for one. She's been here longest and she's nearly 13. In a few years she'll be expected to leave, find work as a maid or a shop girl." Frank's expression was thoughtful. "But if she were our daughter legally, she could stay. Continue her education, perhaps even attend that women's college in St. Louis you've mentioned." Harriet set her sewing aside, moved beyond words by her husband's thoughtfulness, his expanding vision of their family. "You would do that. Take on the legal responsibility for these children, make them your heirs." "Our heirs," he corrected gently. "And yes, without hesitation, They may not have our blood, Harriet, but they have our hearts. Isn't that what truly makes a family? She went to him then, sitting on the arm of his chair and wrapping her arms around his shoulders. You are an extraordinary man, Frank Zimmerman. He pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her waist. I'm just a man who recognizes his blessings when he sees them. He pressed a kiss to her temple. And you, my love, are chief among them. As winter descended on Missouri, bringing with it howling winds and heavy snow, the Zimmerman household grew even larger. 2 more children arrived, brothers, whose father had been killed in a mining accident and whose mother couldn't feed them on her seamstress wages. Harriet welcomed them with the same warmth she showed all who came under her care, while Frank taught them to care for the animals in the barn, a task the boys took to with enthusiasm. Judge Wilson granted the first of their adoption petitions just before Christmas. Hope was officially Hope Zimmerman, their daughter in the eyes of the law as well as in their hearts. Mary's adoption was proceeding as well, though more slowly due to distant relatives who needed to be notified. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, the entire household gathered in the main room of the orphanage. A tall pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper chains, dried berries, and small carved wooden figures that Frank and the older boys had made. Each child, even Hope, hung a stocking on the mantel, then settled around the fire for hot chocolate and the Christmas story. As Harriet read from the Bible, her voice gentle in the firelit room, she was struck by the parallels a child born in humble circumstances, finding family not through blood but through love. She looked up to find Frank watching her, his eyes reflecting the same thought, the same gratitude for the unexpected family they had built together. Later, after the children were asleep, the younger ones vibrating with excitement for the morning's presents, the older ones pretending nonchalance but equally eager, Harriet and Frank returned to their own quarters. Frank built up the fire while Harriet prepared a tray with tea and the special Christmas cookies Mary had helped her bake. I have something for you, Frank said when they were settled before the fire. I wanted to give it to you privately. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in silver paper. Harriet unwrapped it carefully to find a locket on a delicate gold chain. When she opened it, tears filled her eyes. Inside was a tiny photograph of Hope, her serious little face looking out at the camera, and on the opposite side, a lock of her pale hair. Frank, it's beautiful, Harriet breathed, touching the photograph gently. There's room for more, he said, his voice husky with emotion. As our family grows. She let him fasten the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart. I have something for you too, she said, reaching for a package hidden beneath the settee. Frank unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal, the cover tooled with his initials and an image of the orphanage. Open it, she urged. Inside, Harriet had pasted newspaper clippings about the orphanage's opening, photographs of the children, and her own handwritten accounts of milestone moments. Hope's first words. The day the Johnson brothers arrived, Mary winning a prize at school for her essay. It's a record of our family, she explained. I thought someday our children might want to know how it all began. Frank's eyes shone with unshed tears as he carefully turned the pages. This is the most precious gift I've ever received, he said finally, closing the book and holding it against his chest. Thank you. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the fire dance and listening to the wind outside. Then Frank set the journal aside and took Harriet's hands in his. You ever regret it? He asked quietly. The path we've chosen, she looked at him in surprise. Regret? What would I regret? That we couldn't have children of our own, that we had to find another way to build our family. Harriet considered the question seriously, giving it the thoughtful response it deserved. I used to think that not being able to bear children made me somehow less of a woman, less worthy of love. She squeezed his hands. But now I see it differently. If I had been able to have children, would we have built the orphanage? Would Hope have found her way to us? Would Mary be planning for college rather than service? Frank nodded slowly. Our loss opened the door to a different kind of blessing. Exactly. She leaned forward to kiss him softly. So no, Frank, I don't regret a single step of the journey that brought us here. He pulled her closer, his arms strong and sure around her. Nor do I, my love, nor do I. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled, casting its golden light over the man and woman who had found in each other not just love, but a shared vision, a purpose larger than themselves. Their family may not have come to them in the way they once expected, but it was no less precious for being found rather than born. In many ways, it was more so each child a testament to resilience, to hope, to the power of love to heal and transform. As they held each other in the quiet Christmas Eve stillness, Harriet thought of the words Frank had whispered to her that night so long ago, when she had confessed her deepest sorrow, her greatest fear. "You already give me everything," he had said, and in the fullness of time she had come to understand the truth of those words. For what they had built together, this home, this family, this life, was indeed everything. And it was enough. More than enough. It was abundant.